We took turns at my sleepover trying to tell the scariest story we could. I think I won. George yawned and fidgeted on the carpet. The light from my bedside lamp caught his blonde hair and made it shine like a halo. He twirled a lock from his fringe around his index finger, let it snap back into place, then started twirling it again. The kid looked bored. He'd obviously agreed to come round mine for a sleepover because I was new at school, and he wanted to see what kind of house I lived in. Get a sense of what I was like. But I could tell he was already regretting the decision. I thought you said you had a PlayStation. George's eyes flicked around the bedroom, as if he was hoping the console would magically appear from somewhere. We'd been upstairs since dinner. He'd explored my room and we'd chatted for a bit, then watched some random shows on Netflix. Things were going okay at first, but as the last light bled out of the day and the sky outside darkened, I could tell George was losing interest. That was when I suggested we do something a bit different. Nah, I don't have one, I said. Sorry. Are you still up for having a go at this game, though? What, telling each other stories? Isn't that little kid stuff? George glanced at the watch on his wrist. I followed his gaze. George's watch was the first thing I noticed about him. He sits in front of me in English, and I spotted the watch after a ray of sunlight glinted off its face and caught my eye. It's a really nice watch. Most of the kids in my year have digital watches, those blocky ones that light up when you press a button on the side, but George's watch was different. More adult. It was one of the reasons I'd picked George to invite to over. Hey, can I try your watch on? George looked up at me and frowned. What? Your watch? Can I try it on? It's really nice. George stared at me for a second longer. One hand moved to touch the strap on his wrist, as if to make sure it was still secure. Sorry, I don't let anyone try my watch on. My dad says I'm not allowed. He glanced around the room once more, his eye going from the door to the dark window. He sighed. Okay, let's play this dumb game then. What do I have to do? Ignoring the bored look on his face, I smiled. It's really easy. We just take turns telling each other a scary story. Like, the scariest story you can possibly think of. Then whoever's is the scariest wins the game. George rolled his eyes. He stretched his long legs out in front of him. I don't know any scary stories. Besides, I think I might get some sleep soon. I'm pretty tired. Come on, just one each. You must know at least one scary story. Everyone does. Plus, I know loads of good ones. I watched George's face for a reaction. Unless you're one of those kids that frightens easily, that is. Then I guess you might not like the game. It was a risk, but George bit. I'm not scared of anything. The skin below his blonde hair creased into a frown. I've watched horror films with my big brother that are rated 18. We even found one on YouTube that's been banned and I still watched it. I didn't say anything. Just looked back at George and smiled. After a few seconds he let out another sigh. Fine, let's play your stupid game then. But after you're done failing to scare me, that's it. I'm going to bed. George went first. His story wasn't bad, in fairness. It was one he said his uncle told him a couple of years back. Nothing I hadn't heard before. Basically there are two kids, and one of them gets hit by a car and dies. After the funeral, the mother gives the surviving kid some money to go and get liver from the store. Something to cook up for dinner. Because he's sick in the head, though, the kid pockets the money, digs up his brother, and removes his liver instead. Then later that night, the dead brother rises from his grave to come and get the kid in his sleep. It's a decent enough story, but I'd heard it 100 times already. I didn't let on, though. I made all the right faces and jumped at the right parts. George got quite into it. He gestured his arms and his watch glinted in the light from my bedside lamp. His blonde hair spilled across his forehead. He was so into the story he didn't seem to notice. After it was over he sat back, brushed the hair from his eyes, and grinned. I thought you were gonna shit yourself at one point, he said. You might as well give up now, anyway. I'm not scared of anything. I looked across the room at him. The house was quiet now, and had been for a few hours. When we'd first come upstairs there was still noise coming from below, the faint sound of the TV in the lounge, the rattle of plates being put away in the kitchen. Now there was only silence. Beyond the bedroom window, tree branches rustled in the wind. The occasional car passed by on the road outside. That was it. I grinned at George. So you're not scared of anything at all? Nope. Nothing. Not even stories that are true? George let out a bark of laughter. Nice try. Just hurry up and get it over with, will you? I'm already bored. Okay, fine. I shuffled forwards on the carpet so I was sat closer to George. Our knees were almost touching. George frowned, but he didn't move. My story is about a family, I began. A family that looks normal enough on the outside, but isn't really normal at all. George rolled his eyes again. He was starting to annoy me quite a lot by now, but I didn't let on. I just carried on with the story as if I hadn't noticed. This family moves around a lot. They never stay in one place for too long. They can't, you see. The family's good at disguising themselves, they're good at hiding their secret, but they still can't go taking risks. If they stayed in one place for any more than a few weeks, they might get found out. Someone might discover what they really are. So what are they then? I wanted to tell George not to interrupt, to just sit still and listen to the story, but I bit down the urge. Instead, I just grinned at him. The family are monsters, I said. They're all monsters. They travel from town to town, and they leave a trail of dead kids wherever they go. I paused, expecting George to interrupt me again, but he didn't. He only stared back at me. There was no expression on his face as he twirled a lock of blonde hair round his finger. The family has a very specific way of doing things, I continued. When they move into a new area, they find a house that's been left unoccupied. Not a completely empty house, just one where the people that normally live there are off on holiday or something. One that'll be empty for a week or two. The family doesn't need long, see. A couple of weeks suits them just fine. So they break into this house, and then they go about setting the trap. It's their own kid they use. They send him off to make friends in the neighborhood. Round the nearby parks, maybe off to the local school under a fake name. Tell him to get to know the other kids. The family is hungry by this point, really, badly hungry, but they don't do anything just yet. They've learned to be patient. I paused and took a breath. This was a story I'd told before, but I found I liked it more and more with each retelling. The trick was not to rush, though. You had to savor it. I'd opened the bedroom window when we first came upstairs, and now a draft of cold air blew in. It ruffled the curtains behind George. Tree branches shook in the garden outside, the leaves whispering to each other. George watched me, not saying anything. I had his attention. The kid's parents don't have to wait long, I continued. They never do. They've trained the kid well, see? He's not just a victim in all this. He may only be young, but he knows how the game works. Once the family has been in the area for a little while, a few days, maybe a week at most, the kid makes his choice. He picks a new friend to invite back to their house. The parents give him an incentive, too. He's still too young to share the tastes they have. They tell him that's something he'll only acquire when he gets older, but he still gets something out of it. What does he get out of it? George's eyes were fixed on mine. His finger kept twirling the same lock of hair over and over again. He gets the other kids' stuff, I replied. Whoever he picks. He gets to keep all their belongings after his parents are finished with them. Somewhere in the house below us, a door slammed. George's eyes flicked away from mine towards the bedroom door, then back again. I smiled at him. So? George kept his eyes on me as he tried to formulate the question. So? What exactly do the parents? What do they do with the kids they take? Oh, they eat them, I replied. They eat their insides. They tear the kids open while they're still screaming, and they pull out their guts and intestines by the handful. Wolf everything down until there's nothing left but a husk. I grinned. Somewhere below us, a floorboard creaked. The sound was faint and muffled, and I don't think George heard it. Can you imagine what someone looks like when they've had everything inside them removed? They hardly even look like a person at all. It's like the stuff a snake leaves behind when it sheds its skin. The glow from the bedside lamp made George's skin look pale. His lips were slightly parted as he stared at me. But how do they get away with it? He asked. Don't the parents of the kids that get taken come looking for them the next day? When their kids don't show up back home? I grinned back at George. I'd been hoping he'd ask this. Oh, the family's long gone by that point, I said. They vanish like shadows in the night. The only thing they take with them is the remains of the dead kid. And when their parents come looking for them the next day, all they find is a locked house that belongs to somebody else. Another floorboard creaked. It was louder this time, and we both heard it. The sound had come from the corridor outside the bedroom. George's head swiveled in the direction of the door. His eyes were wide in his pale face. What was that? Oh, that was nothing, I lied. Probably just the house settling. There's nothing to be scared of, George. I eyed the watch on his wrist and imagined what it would look like on mine. From the corridor outside came the soft sound of approaching footsteps. I've been a search and rescue diver for 12 years. We see a lot of strange and disgusting things, but what I saw last week has me questioning both my job and reality. I've been involved with water search and rescue for 12 years now. I've seen a lot of upsetting and even unexplainable things in my time, but those pale in comparison to what I saw recently. Water search and rescue is often a depressing job. When someone gets lost in a forest, they can still be found alive days later. But when we get a call, it's almost always body recovery. People don't last long in the water. I can't tell you exactly where, but I live in a northern territory known for its water sports. Fishing, kayaking, diving, whatever it is, our waters probably have a solid reputation for it. Despite that, this area isn't some kind of resort. The waters here are cold and oftentimes vicious. Search and rescue operations here can be grueling, and not many stick with it. There are a few older guys who have been doing it longer than me, but I'm one of the most experienced around. Like I said before, this job is more body recovery than anything, especially here. We save more live moose from the water than live humans. And when we get a call about a missing child, well, we'd be better off just giving our condolences. That's just how the waters are here. Our small town has one of the highest drowning rates in the country. But we look anyway, and usually we find a body. I've considered quitting many times in my career. Most people quit after their first recovery. In training, we try to emphasize just how much water can distort a corpse, but nothing can prepare you for the harsh reality. It's not uncommon for us to find bodies bloated beyond recognition. Sometimes they barely even seem human. A lot of divers don't last long after seeing something like that. But I continued to do it after all these years. I figured if I didn't, then no one would. However, the things I saw last week have made me reconsider that decision. I got the call around 11 a.m. A father had taken his 10-year-old son fly fishing. At one point, the father managed to stab a hook all the way through his finger. He went back up to his truck to get a first aid kit. The boy was gone when he returned a few minutes later. When I first heard the story, I hung my head in silence for a moment. It had been raining heavily for almost a month now, and the waters were running faster than ever. To make things worse, it was unusually cold for the season. A number of people had gone missing in recent weeks. Many of them had yet to be found. I had little hope of finding the boy alive. Me and a couple of other divers were at the site where the boy went missing within an hour, and a larger search and rescue team located a few towns over was headed our way. We talked with the father and even searched the forest for a bit, hoping that he had just wandered off. But eventually we realized that we would have to begin searching in the river. The moment I got in the water, I knew the boy was gone. The current was worse than it had ever been, and even I had difficulty navigating the icy river. We looked for hours in the surrounding areas, and even expanded our search once the larger team had arrived. The boy was nowhere to be found. I was surprised. I hadn't expected to find him alive, but I had at least anticipated finding a body. However, there was no trace of him. The sun got low and the air grew colder. We were considering calling it off as nightfall approached and resuming the search the next day when I discovered something. There's a lot of creek beds around the river. Many of them have dried up as a result of encroaching vegetation or man-made efforts to divert the water. We usually don't pay any attention to them. However, with all of the recent rain, I noticed that one of the larger creek beds had begun flowing again. A surprising amount of water crashed through it, easily enough to carry a young boy. The creek ran directly across a bend in the river, connecting it at 2 points. I followed it and realized that the boy could be located outside of our initial search area. As I approached where the creek reconnected with the main river, I felt a sinking feeling in my gut. There's a place in the river where not even search and rescue divers are supposed to go. It's known as Badwater. This area lies on one half of the river and runs for about 100 yards. It's near a densely vegetated area, so we don't often have to worry about people swimming there. But a lot of disappearances occur in the surrounding waters. Despite that, I've been warned not to dive there since I began doing search and rescue. Supposedly, the undercurrent is so strong that even the most experienced swimmer would be swept away in an instant. Don't go near bad water. It was a mantra of the older divers. The creek ended exactly in the center of the bad water region. As I reached it, I stopped and chewed my lip thoughtfully. If I went back and reported this to the other divers, they would tell me to let it go. They wouldn't let me dive there. But deep down I felt like the boy's body must be tangled up in some weeds nearby. If only I could find it. I hated the idea of that kid being stuck down there, slowly bloating and rotting away while his parents sat at home wondering where their boy had gone. Bad water didn't seem to be that bad. I'd seen rougher waters before, but I knew looks could be deceiving. Just below the surface, it could be flowing faster than I ever imagined. And I'd be swept away in an instant. Besides, I wasn't supposed to dive alone. I almost turned back, but something made me stay. I stared into the river for a moment, thinking about the boy. Then I put on my gear and dropped into the icy waters. The first thing I noticed was that the current actually seemed pretty weak. As a matter of fact, it was weaker than the rest of the river. The water was extremely deep there, and I could see only blackness below as I dove. I kicked deeper and deeper, thinking that the current might pick up lower down, but the opposite seemed to be true. The water was almost completely still. I went even deeper until finally green shapes began to materialize in front of me. I thought I'd finally reached a bed of weeds. But, as I kicked lower, the truth came into full view. I felt vomit come up at the sight, an odd and dangerous sensation when you're wearing a scuba mask. Countless arms stuck up from the ground below. I thought I had come upon a trove of bodies, but the disgusting reality became even more apparent only a moment later. The arms grew directly into the ground. They even had roots that spread out from the base. It was as if someone had cut off hundreds of arms at the shoulder and planted them there. They were green, and I watched as they clutched at the water around them. They varied in size and seemingly age. Grotesque baby hands sprouted near the bottom, and they opened and closed their fists hungrily. It was then that I saw the boy. His eyes stared sightlessly ahead as those grotesque arms pulled his dead body downward. It seemed they had just gotten a hold of him. The arms yanked at him, burying him in the surrounding sediment. They pushed and writhed and squirmed until he was securely buried up to the chest. I stared in mesmerized horror. That was when the other bodies came into focus. There must have been at least 4 more, all in varying stages of decay. Some were bloated beyond recognition, only bulky, white masses that protruded loosely from the riverbed. I once again felt vomit rising in my throat and swallowed it back down. The hands were feeding off the bodies, using them as fertilizer. The moment I clambered out of the water, I tore my mask off and retched. I couldn't stop thinking about those disgusting bodies, those grasping hands. They were like some sort of carnivorous plant, yet they were so humanoid. I vomited again at the thought. I frantically ran back to our base camp and pulled one of the other divers aside. Moose was the most experienced person on our team. He'd been diving for over 20 years ever since moving here. I told him about what I saw. When I finished, he stared at me in cold silence. I told you never to go near bad water. His voice contained an iciness that even his thick Louisiana accent couldn't conceal. That's what you're concerned about? I was incredulous. He placed a hand on my shoulder and squeezed tightly. Don't tell anyone else about this. If the others find out you went into bad water. He trailed off and thought for a moment. Well, it won't be good. He shook his head like a disappointed father. But what about those things? I tried to keep my voice down, hoping no one would hear us. How many people have died because of those strange things? Shut up. Moose said. We have an agreement. There's a reason they only grow in bad water. I started to say something, but the words caught in my throat. He was keeping something from me. He sighed and I saw something like sadness behind his eyes. Sometimes you have to decide between lesser and greater evils. Even the best possible decisions can still keep you up at night. He went silent for a moment and only stared at me. Don't tell anyone about this. Maybe one day you'll understand. He walked away after that and called off the day's search. Despite what I'd told him, we continued to search for the next 2 days. By the 3rd day we called it off completely and gave our condolences to the family. I don't know what is happening. Moose has been acting different towards me ever since. There's an iciness to him, but every now and then he'll shoot me a knowing glance, like we're in on some secret together. I've noticed the other older divers acting strangely too. What did he mean by agreement? I'm considering quitting and moving away from here. I can't live with the knowledge that those things are down there, slowly feeding off the body of a young boy among countless others.